It was a dark and stormy night at Peppa's house. The wind howled through the trees, and rain pattered against the windows. Peppa and George were supposed to be sleeping, but strange sounds were coming from the attic above their bedroom. "Peppa, George, did you hear that? It sounds like footsteps. But Mummy and Daddy are downstairs watching television. Who could be walking around up there?" "George, dinosaur scared. The sounds are getting louder, Peppa. Maybe we should tell Mummy and Daddy about the noises in the attic." But as they crept toward their bedroom door, the sounds suddenly stopped. The house fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the storm outside. Peppa felt a chill run down her spine. "Peppa, the silence is even scarier than the noises, George. Something doesn't feel right. The air feels different, colder, like something is watching us from the shadows." Suddenly, a long, dark shadow appeared under their bedroom door. It moved slowly, as if searching for something. The shadow had no owner that they could see. "George, Peppa, look at the shadow. It's moving by itself. Shadows aren't supposed to move without someone making them. This is very, very scary. Peppa, we need to be brave, George. Maybe it's just a tree branch casting shadows from the storm outside. But why does it look like it has long, thin fingers reaching toward us?" The shadow began to grow larger and darker, creeping under the door and spreading across their bedroom floor. It seemed to be alive, moving with purpose and intelligence. "Peppa, George, hide under the blankets. The shadow is getting bigger. It's covering our toys, our books, everything, and it feels so cold wherever it touches." From somewhere in the darkness, they heard a whisper. It was soft and distant, but unmistakably calling their names. "Peppa, George, come to the attic. George, did you hear that, Peppa? Someone is calling our names." But the voice sounds strange, like it's coming from very far away, or from somewhere that doesn't exist. "Peppa, we shouldn't go to the attic, George. Mummy and Daddy always said never to go up there alone. But the voice keeps calling us. Sounds familiar but wrong somehow." Despite their fear, curiosity began to overcome them. The mysterious voice continued to call, growing slightly louder each time. "Come and play. Come and see what's waiting for you. Peppa, maybe we should just peek. Just a quick look to see what's making those sounds. We'll stay together, and if anything scary happens, we'll run straight to Mummy and Daddy." They crept out of their room and toward the attic stairs. Each step creaked loudly in the scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom. But something felt different. The sunlight seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across her pink walls. As she got dressed, she noticed her reflection in the mirror was smiling even though she wasn't. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her movements were too precise, too mechanical. When she turned to greet Peppa, her smile stretched just a little too wide across her face. Daddy Pig sat reading his newspaper, but the pages were completely blank. His glasses reflected nothing, creating two dark voids where his eyes should be. When he spoke, his voice echoed as if coming from somewhere far away. George was at the table, clutching his dinosaur toy, but the toy's eyes had changed. They followed Peppa as she moved around the room, and its plastic smile had become more sinister. After breakfast, the family visited Grandpa Pig's garden. But as they walked down the familiar path, the trees grew taller and their branches reached down like gnarled fingers. The flowers had turned black, their petals falling like tears. Grandpa Pig was tending to his vegetables, but the carrots and potatoes had faces carved into them, all wearing the same unsettling grin. His boat rocked gently in the pond despite the absence of any wind. When they returned home, Peppa's friends came to visit. Susie Sheep arrived first, but her wool was matted and gray, and she spoke in whispers. Rebecca Rabbit hopped into the garden, but her ears drooped unnaturally. Pedro Pony galloped over, but his hooves made no sound on the ground. All of Peppa's friends gathered in a circle, but their shadows pointed in different directions despite the single sun overhead. As the day wore on, the house itself began to change. The yellow walls started to pulse like a heartbeat, and the purple sofa seemed to breathe. The television turned on by itself, showing only static. The family portrait on the wall began to shift, with the painted figures moving their eyes to watch whoever walked by. The stairs creaked with footsteps even when no one was climbing them. When evening came, the sun set too quickly, plunging the world into darkness. The stars formed patterns that hurt to look at directly, and the moon wore the same wide smile. As Peppa prepared for bed, she looked in her mirror one last time. Her reflection waved goodbye, but Peppa's own hand remained at her side. The reflection's smile grew wider until it filled the entire mirror. The next morning, everything returned to normal, but Peppa couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in another reflection, another version of her family was still smiling those two wide smiles. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up, but something felt different. The sunlight seemed dimmer, casting strange shadows across her pink walls. Her reflection in the mirror was moving just a fraction too late. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast in eerie silence. Her eyes never blinked, and her smile seemed frozen. George sat staring at his cereal bowl, but the milk inside was slowly turning black. Daddy Pig entered with glasses reflecting only darkness. His voice echoed from somewhere far away. The family sat for breakfast, but nobody ate. They just moved their spoons in endless circles, creating rhythmic scraping sounds. At playgroup, Peppa's friends stood perfectly still in a circle. Susie Sheep's wool had turned gray, her eyes becoming hollow black holes. Pedro Pony's mane hung lifeless. When Peppa spoke to them, they turned in unison, mouths opening to reveal rows of sharp teeth. The playground equipment moved on its own. Swings swayed with no one on them, creaking haunting melodies. The slides stretched impossibly long into a dark tunnel. The seesaw rocked faster and faster. Madame Gazelle stood with antlers grown into twisted branches scraping the ceiling. When she opened her mouth to sing, only low growls emerged. Children's drawings on the wall transformed into dark, twisted images. Peppa realized she was the only normal one. Everyone else moved like puppets on invisible strings. The sky had turned sickly green, clouds forming grinning faces. The school bell rang with deep, ominous tolls. Her friends walked toward her with jerky movements. Their eyes had turned completely black, speaking in unison with voices not their own. Peppa tried to run, but hallways became a maze. Every door led to the same classroom where Madame Gazelle waited with her twisted smile. Walls closed in, floors tilted impossibly. Finally, Peppa found herself home, but everything was wrong. Furniture in same places but slightly off. Colors too bright, shadows too dark, silence too complete. In her room, Peppa looked in the mirror. Her reflection smiled back, but Peppa wasn't smiling. The reflection waved while Peppa stood frozen. Then the reflection stepped out, and Peppa realized she was trapped behind the glass. The episode ended with cheerful laughter echoing through the house, but Peppa knew nothing would ever be the same. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening at Peppa's house when something very strange began to happen. Peppa and George were playing in their bedroom when they noticed their toys moving by themselves. The teddy bears turned their heads slowly, their button eyes gleaming in the dim light. George's favorite dinosaur toy started making sounds it had never made before, low, rumbling growls that seemed to come from somewhere deep and dark. Peppa tried to tell Mummy Pig what was happening, but when she went downstairs, she found Mummy Pig standing perfectly still in the kitchen, her back turned. When Peppa called out, Mummy Pig slowly turned around, but her smile was too wide, stretching across her face in a way that made Peppa's stomach feel cold. Her eyes were completely black, like deep holes in her head. Daddy Pig was sitting in his chair reading the newspaper, but the newspaper was upside down, and he wasn't blinking, not even once. When Peppa spoke to him, he just kept reading, his lips moving silently as if he was whispering secrets to himself. The television was on, but it was showing the same image over and over, a picture of their house, but all the windows were dark except for one. In that window, a shadow was watching. George started crying, but his tears were black, and when they hit the floor, they made a sizzling sound. The house began to feel different, like it was breathing. The walls seemed to pulse gently, and the floorboards creaked in a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. All the family photos on the walls had changed in every picture. There was an extra figure standing behind the family, a dark shape that shouldn't have been there. The grandfather clock in the hallway started chiming, but it chimed 13 times instead of 12. With each chime, the lights in the house grew dimmer. Peppa grabbed George's hand and they ran upstairs, but the stairs seemed to go on forever, stretching higher and higher. Behind them, they could hear Mummy and Daddy Pig laughing, but it wasn't their normal laugh. It was hollow and echoing, like it was coming from very far away. When they finally reached their bedroom, they found that all their toys had arranged themselves in a perfect circle on the floor. In the center of the circle was a music box that had never been there before. It was playing a lullaby, but the melody was wrong, twisted and sad. The toys were all facing inward, toward the music box, as if they were watching it very carefully. Peppa and George hugged each other tightly as the music box slowly wound down. When the music finally stopped, everything went completely silent. Then, one by one, all the toys turned to look at them with eyes that glowed softly in the darkness, and they all began to smile the same too-wide smile that Mummy Pig had worn downstairs. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was Peppa's birthday, and everyone in the family was excited to celebrate. But when Peppa woke up that morning, she noticed something strange about her birthday cards. Each one showed the same date, but the year kept changing backwards. First it was last year, then 2 years ago, then 5 years ago, as if time itself was moving in reverse. Downstairs, the birthday decorations were already up, but they looked faded and old, as if they had been hanging there for decades. The balloons were deflated and gray, and the streamers hung limply from the ceiling like cobwebs. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen preparing the birthday cake, but when Peppa looked closer, she saw that the candles were already melted down to nothing. "Happy birthday, Peppa," said Daddy Pig, but his voice sounded distant and echoing, as if he was speaking from very far away. When Peppa turned to look at him, she noticed that he appeared slightly transparent, like a ghost. George was sitting at the table, but he wasn't moving at all, just staring ahead with a blank expression. The birthday party guests began to arrive, but something was terribly wrong with each of them. Susie Sheep came first, but her wool was completely white, and she moved in slow motion. Pedro Pony arrived next, but he was walking backwards, as if the film of his life was being played in reverse. When it came time to blow out the candles, Peppa discovered that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make them go out. Instead, the flames grew bigger and bigger, casting strange shadows on the walls that moved independently of the people in the room. The shadows seemed to be acting out a different party entirely, one where everyone was crying instead of celebrating. As the party continued, Peppa realized that her friends were repeating the same conversations over and over again. "Happy birthday, Peppa," they would say, then pause for exactly 10 seconds, then say it again. Their movements became more and more mechanical, like wind-up toys that were slowly running down. The birthday cake was brought out, but when Peppa looked at it closely, she saw that it was covered in dust and the frosting had turned gray. When Peppa tried to cut the cake, the knife went right through it as if it wasn't really there. The cake was just an illusion, a memory of birthdays past. The guests began to leave one by one, but instead of walking out the door, they simply faded away like morning mist. First Pedro disappeared, then Susie, then all the others until only Peppa and her family remained. But even they were becoming less solid, less real with each passing moment. Peppa ran to the window to look outside, but instead of the familiar garden, she saw an endless gray void. There were no trees, no grass, no sky, just emptiness stretching on forever. She realized that she wasn't in her real house anymore, but trapped in some kind of memory or dream of a birthday that had never actually happened. As the last of the decorations faded away and the room became completely empty, Peppa heard a voice whisper, "Every birthday is the same birthday, Peppa. You can never grow older here." She looked in the mirror and saw that she looked exactly the same as she always had, and she understood that in this place, she would remain forever young, forever celebrating the same birthday that would never end. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when Peppa and George decided to play hide and seek in their house. The storm outside made everything darker than usual, and the wind howled through the trees in their garden. Mummy Pig was busy in the kitchen, and Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper in the living room, just like any other day. Peppa counted to 10 while George ran off to find the perfect hiding spot. When she opened her eyes and began searching, she noticed something strange. Every room she entered seemed slightly different from how she remembered it. The pictures on the walls showed faces she didn't recognize, and the furniture was arranged in ways that felt wrong. She called out for George, but her voice echoed strangely through the house, as if the walls were much further away than they should be. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly in both directions. New doors appeared where there had never been doors before, leading to rooms that shouldn't exist. Behind one of these mysterious doors, Peppa found a room filled with toys that looked exactly like hers, but they were all wrong somehow. Her favorite teddy bear sat in the corner, but its button eyes had been replaced with real eyes that blinked and followed her movements. The dollhouse in the center of the room was an exact replica of their house, but tiny figures inside were moving on their own. As Peppa watched in fascination and growing fear, she realized that the tiny figures in the dollhouse were her family. Tiny Mummy Pig was cooking in the miniature kitchen, Tiny Daddy Pig was reading his tiny newspaper, and there was even a tiny version of herself, searching through the tiny rooms just as she was doing in the real house. The tiny Peppa in the dollhouse looked up and waved at her. When the real Peppa waved back, she noticed that her reflection in the dollhouse window was waving too, but a few seconds too late. The tiny Peppa's mouth moved as if she was trying to say something important, but no sound came out. Suddenly, Peppa heard George crying from somewhere deep in the house. She ran toward the sound, but every door she opened led to another identical room filled with the same wrong toys and the same dollhouse. Each dollhouse contained the same scene, but the tiny figures were in slightly different positions, as if time was moving differently in each one. The crying grew louder and more desperate. Peppa realized that the sound wasn't coming from the real George, but from one of the tiny George in one of the dollhouses. She leaned closer to listen and saw that all the tiny figures in all the dollhouses had stopped what they were doing and were now staring directly at her. Their tiny faces had changed. Where there should have been simple, happy expressions, there were now looks of terror and desperation. The tiny Mummy Pig was pointing frantically at something behind the real Peppa. The tiny Daddy Pig was shaking his head violently, as if trying to warn her about something. When Peppa turned around, she saw that the room had filled with dozens of other children, all looking exactly like her friends from playgroup, but their eyes were completely white and they moved in perfect synchronization. They all raised their hands at the same time, pointed at her at the same time, and opened their mouths at the same time. Instead of words, a sound like rushing wind came from their mouths, growing louder and louder until it drowned out George's crying. The dollhouses began to shake and rattle on their tables, and the tiny figures inside were running around frantically, trying to escape from their miniature prison. Peppa tried to run, but found that her legs wouldn't move. She looked down and saw that her feet had become part of the floor, as if she was slowly sinking into the house itself. The white-eyed children began walking toward her in their synchronized way, their footsteps making no sound on the carpet. As they got closer, Peppa could see that they weren't really her friends at all. They were something else wearing the shapes of her friends, something that had been waiting in the house for a very long time. The dollhouses continued to shake more violently, and she could hear the tiny voices of her family calling her name from inside their miniature world. The last thing Peppa saw before everything went dark was one of the dollhouses falling to the floor and breaking open. The tiny figures of her family spilled out and began running toward her, but they were no bigger than her thumb, and the white-eyed children were stepping on them as they advanced, crushing the tiny voices one by one until there was only silence.